Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Round Series. My name is Joe Saramelli, and I oversee our Grand Round Series. In October 2020, we shifted Grand Rounds to a webinar format, and we've had a series of presentations across several areas. I'd like to encourage you to complete the post-Grand Rounds evaluation, which went out with the Grand Rounds announcement. I read the comments and the evaluations. It's helpful for us with getting Grand Rounds going forward. I'd like to move into talking about today's presenter. Today's Grand Rounds presenter is Dr. Tia Powell. And Dr. Powell holds the Trachtenberg Chair in Bioethics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and is Professor of Epidemiology and Psychiatry. Dr. Powell directs the Montefiore Einstein Center for Bioethics and notably chairs a committee for the National Academy of Medicine to recommend steps for the next decade of social science research to support those with dementia and their caregivers. Two brief points about Dr. Powell's training and history. One is Dr. Powell had completed psychiatry residency and then subsequently a consultation liaison fellowship at Columbia University, and later completed a health and aging policy fellowship where Dr. Powell worked at the Department of Health and Human Services as an expert to the National Alzheimer's Project Act on ethics and dementia. I think to me, these two fellowships seem to summarize two major domains of Dr. Powell's work, one in policy related to bioethical tensions, and the other in direct clinical care to patients with more immediate ethical challenges. In fact, Dr. Powell founded the Clinical Ethics Consultation Service at Columbia, and later went on to direct all of bioethics from policy to clinical care at the Montefiore Einstein Hospital System in the Bronx. Generally, I'd stop there, but I'll take just one more minute. Today, Dr. Powell will talk to us about the past and future of dementia. And Dr. Powell recently published a book on this topic. I'd like to read just a two-sentence quote from chapter 11. Dementia's onset is slow. The day of diagnosis is not the day of oblivion. You can choose to see that gradual loss as a glass half empty or half full. And I think seeing the glass half full is a challenge for society and possibly an even greater challenge for clinicians. And as psychiatrists and mental health professionals, we have experience with preserving control and independence, such as when caring for younger adults with serious mental illness. And Dr. Powell challenges us to take a new stance of optimism, caring, and preserving dignity for individuals diagnosed with dementia. Dr. Powell.
Thank you so much. That's really very kind of you. I'm very happy to be here today, or be virtually there today. And let me share my screen and I'll get started on our talk today. I'm gonna bumble around for a minute while I do this and get into the full, there we go, okay. So I'm gonna think with you today about dementia care, its history, present, and future. And I hope we'll have some time for discussion and dialogue at the end. And I've lost track of my little, there we go. All right. I really am not going to talk very much at all about medications, and certainly not in any naughty way that would get me in trouble with the CME sponsors. So just a quick overview. Right now, I mean, we're in a terrible time. We're in the middle of a major public health disaster. So this is in some ways the worst time to think about a chronic problem, any chronic problem we have, including what we could do better in terms of dementia care. But it's also probably the best time. Let's think about COVID and dementia. COVID with dementia, as with a lot of things, exploits the existing flaws in our system, and it shows us everything, where the cracks are. It's like sort of horrible flood water that's seeping into into our foundations, the foundations of our healthcare system, and it is going to make everything fall apart. People with dementia are at incredibly high risk for COVID. Their care, even in better times, is fragmented. It's expensive and inadequate, and there's very limited choice for most people in the country. So how can we together, we health professionals and just we people, all of us aging minute by minute. How can we work together toward care that we ourselves would want? A few facts, nothing here is new for you, but just to keep them top of mind while we're thinking. Just in the US, there are nearly 6 million people today with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. And unfortunately, our numbers are increasing because our population is aging. So even though the cohort, say of 80-year-olds or 70-year-olds in our aging population, in each cohort, the percent of people with dementia is actually going down, which is good news. But yet still, since there's so many more of us living to a great age, our numbers of people with dementia are continuing to go up. And unfortunately, we have no disease modifying treatment. We have some palliative drugs that can help control the symptoms a little bit, but none of the medications that we have for dementia addresses effectively any underlying mechanism. And our success rate with dementia research to find that cure, many incredibly smart people are looking for it. We're basically nowhere. 99.6% failure rate in major dementia trials in the last 10 to 20 years. That is way worse than what we've seen in heart failure drugs and cancer drugs, you name it. Pretty much every serious disease is ahead of dementia. So we're not making rapid progress here, nor do I particularly expect we will do so, but I'm getting there. So why is there no cure? Why is dementia so much harder than other things? We've made actually pretty good success in a number of other illnesses. So I'm going to run through a very, very brief history. And actually, because it happens to be Black History Month, I've heard people sardonically joke, yeah, that's right, it's the shortest month, February, so we'll make that one Black History Month. Nonetheless, I will, with your indulgence, lean into an interesting aspect in the history of dementia, which is also African-American history. I'll look at a few early successes, and unfortunately, we'll have to deal with some recent failures. So here is Alois Alzheimer. We all know something that he's famous for, and that is all of his fame in that particular regard of dementia stems from a fascinating case, that of Auguste D., who was admitted to a psychiatric hospital because psychiatry was the overarching domain for dementia and all sorts of things at that point. She was admitted in 1901. She was young for dementia. She was 51 years old. She had progressively increasing symptoms. She started out with paranoia. She was very worried about her husband strolling about with one of the neighbor ladies. She began to have memory lapses. She could no longer really function as a homemaker. Her sort of, standby standard recipes, she could no longer really put together effectively. She started making pretty significant errors with handling money, and she had been handling reasonably complicated household accounts perfectly well for years, and then she couldn't do it. 5 years from beginning to end. She dies in 1906, and Alzheimer published the case in 1907. What's unusual here, he was not the one to discover the pathology that he describes in that famous 1907 paper, but he makes a conceptual leap and links it to the symptoms of dementia, saying these abnormal findings in pathology, I believe, are the cause of this patient's symptoms. His own, Alzheimer's own mentor was Emil Kraepelin, one of the outstanding scientists of the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, was obviously an enormous presence in psychiatry. Not just a basic scientist, certainly, but also a clinician scientist. And he published a textbook in 1910. And in that textbook, he thought, I'm going to take that strange case that Alzheimer discovered of a young person with what looks like senile dementia. And there were a handful, maybe less than 6 other cases of these young people. He batched them together and he named the syndrome after his pupil, his erstwhile pupil, Alzheimer. So that is the origin of Alzheimer's disease. It was a rare, unusual finding of what looked like senile dementia, as it was then called, in a younger person, usually in their 50s. We've long since found actually some rare genetic variants in that part of the world that correspond probably to what Auguste D and some of the other people had. But it was only in the 1970s where brain scientists really settled on the notion that actually we don't think there's a difference in the pathology between people who have early onset dementia and late onset dementia. Let's link those all together and call them Alzheimer's disease. That's a sort of new, if you will, back formation from the 1970s. The original Alzheimer's disease was early onset. So why do I bother you with all that? Because of this guy. He's not someone I discovered, but I knew nothing of Solomon Carter Fuller until I started researching a book. And you know, I try to be efficient, like all of us. I have a family, I have a job, I'm trying to get stuff done. I was so inefficient. And when I was most inefficient was when I had most fun researching my book. I totally went down the rabbit hole reading about Solomon Carter Fuller, and not all of it ends up in the book, but I found him incredibly fascinating. And also for me, really a hero. He has some incredibly wonderful characteristics that I admire. So let me tell you something of Solomon Carter Fuller. He was born in Liberia. He was the grandson of US slaves who had, his grandparents had gone to Liberia when that was possible. And it was a movement that we will escape enslavement in America and return to Africa, and that will be better. He, however, was an incredibly bright young man and extremely ambitious about education. So he came back, he came to the US at age 17, leaving Liberia behind forever, and enrolled in Livingstone College. We would call that today an historic Black college. In 1890 or so, it wasn't so historic, but that was a college that would accept him coming from Africa and being Black. And he went there. He then thought, yeah, but that's not enough for me. I want to be a doctor. So he gets himself into Boston University. Harvard had thought that they would start a scholarship for a promising Black scholar, but they didn't have their act together. So he heard about it, but it wasn't really ready for another year. He didn't have the time to spare. So off to Boston University, where he got a great education. When he graduates, unsurprisingly to us, very difficult to find a job. But actually what he loved to do was pathology, which was unpopular then. It's kind of like, what a waste. What are you doing that for? We don't understand how that connects to psychiatry. He loved it though, and really excelled at it. So he got a job doing essentially autopsies at Westboro State, which was a public psychiatric hospital. So he began to do autopsies there, specifically looking at brains for the most part. And he really got into this. He then did that for a while at Bellevue in New York City. And there he consulted with some incredibly eminent scholars of neuropathology in the brain. And he said, what do I need to do to be the best possible scholar? And they said, well, I mean, the real elite, you got to go to Europe and study. We got nothing in the US in 1890. I mean, we're not there. Germany, Austria, that's where you got to go. So he applied. And, you know, in effect, this was Alzheimer's Lab in 1903 was arguably the best, certainly among the best places in the world at that point to study neuropathology. He took on 5 new young scholars that year, and one of them was Solomon Carter Fuller. So that's how he gets started. And what does he do there? He studies for 2 years. He does the whole thing in German, which was then the language of science. So like you do, you go to Germany, you're working in German. One of the particular strengths of both Kraepelin and Alzheimer's was learning a new science of staining and fixing things and using microscopic studies to really look at the brain in a way that was quite new then. I mean, this is really just getting started. Before that, people couldn't do it. And Fuller became quite accomplished at this. So he brings back these fantastic cutting edge new staining techniques, and he really gets into photography and the microscope. So he begins to publish. In 1907, he publishes an article in the American Journal of Insanity, later renamed to the American Journal of Psychiatry in the late, I think the 1940s, good change. At that time, the American Journal of Insanity was the journal for anything to do with psychiatry, and really a lot of what we might think of as neurology today. So he published this paper. I show you a slide from it to show you that it's beautiful. It's scientifically quite detailed. In creatively wasting time, I read most of the back issues of the American Journal of Insanity, all digitally, beautifully preserved today. Most of the papers in there, let's just say they don't really stand the test of time today. There's a lot of the resource material for racial prejudice. You know, why are Negroes so happy all the time? Why are Jews so anxious? Okay. Many of the papers back then, I shouldn't paint with too broad a brush. Some really do begin to show us the way we think today about psychiatric illness. But most are brief papers, case reports, that kind of thing. What Fuller published was a dissertation. It's basically 67 pages full of incredibly detailed and accurate scientific description with beautiful illustrations, either microscopic plates blown up or detailed pen and ink drawings. It's quite masterful work. And the reason I started researching him is that flipping through these old journals, you're just struck, like, what is this now? Who is this person? What is this kind of serious scientific, almost really very contemporary looking work doing in a journal from 1907? These are some of his, some are slides in here, I think some are drawings as well. This is what he publishes in 1911. And here's where he starts to get into trouble. Alzheimer's paper was recognized in the US as being something interesting and important, really connecting neuropathology with symptoms. And that was something Fuller was incredibly interested in, something he learned from Alzheimer. So when he did his pathology studies, his autopsies, he always also looked at the clinical record and tried to compare things. He writes in this 1911 paper, essentially, he doesn't address his former mentor, Alzheimer, by name, but he appears to me to be speaking to him, saying, I don't actually think those plaques you've described really correlate that well with who has dementia. Fuller goes on to do some beautiful studies, including one where he takes older people of the symptoms of dementia, older people, and these are all autopsy studies, older people who died with the symptoms of what looked like dementia. And of course, the definitions have evolved over time. Older people who died without any symptoms that look like dementia, and younger people with symptoms that might look like serious mental illness, and younger people who died without any of that. And what he comes up with is some really interesting information. He says something that we didn't rediscover until the 1970s, something that contrasted markedly with his mentor's claims, that there was no pathological difference that he could see between younger people and older people who had dementia. He saw those plaques, he saw tangles, and he saw really the same kind of presentation, both in younger and older people. He's writing this in 1911. It's not the 1970s until we hear that again. He also said, you know, I see brains without pathology, without this pathology and the symptoms of dementia, and I see brains with pathology and no symptoms of dementia. And I really have to say, I don't think we can limit dementia to this business of the plaques. They're doing something, but as a scientist, I'm not sure what it is. And he basically tells us plaques are neither necessary nor sufficient for what we think of as Alzheimer's dementia. So that's 1911. Can I tell you, neuropathologists, which I'm not, are still arguing about this today. And there's not clear evidence, but one way or the other. But I would say it is pretty clear we don't know everything about how those plaques correlate to the onset of symptoms of dementia. There are plenty of old people today who die with wonderfully successful cognition and have plenty of plaques, and it's not because they're dying young. We haven't cracked that riddle. And Alzheimer's, because he was a serious scientist and he didn't care if he would get in trouble for telling the truth, called us on it. I find that really impressive. He had a certain blush with fame. This is a famous photograph of when Freud, I don't know if you can see my pointer, Freud is right there smack dab in the middle. This is when he visits the US. He goes to Clark University and he's surrounded. I don't know if you can read all these names by Jung and by his biographers. There are lots of people. And up in the very tippy top right-hand corner, that's Fuller. Because of his connection to the elite scientists of Europe, they knew that it would be important for Freud to meet somebody like him and have him included. It was not as easy for Solomon Carter Fuller to be so well recognized in the US. Time and again, he was passed over for promotion. Boston University was good enough to hire him, which is not true of other institutions at the time. Nonetheless, they did not treat him as I'm sure they now would have wished to have treated him. He did the work of being the department chair for 5 years, was never given the title. And indeed, ultimately, they appointed a younger white physician to the title and he resigned. So he had a rough go of it, but he did beautiful work and the people who knew him respected that work. I don't want to be too negative because actually, I don't think Fuller had such a bad life. He was a man of enormous dignity and quiet charm. This is his wife, Meta Vo Warwick Fuller. She was an incredibly accomplished sculptor. She studied in her youth with Rodin. She went to Paris. She was a real voyager. And she was quite taken up in the Harlem Renaissance and has in her own right a great deal of fame. They lived in a house in Framingham, Massachusetts. Neighbors tried to prevent him from building there. And he knew that people would try to do that. So they talked to the bank and had the bank say they wouldn't give him a loan. And he agreed to meet with the bank president and said, I assumed I couldn't get a loan. I saved all the money in advance. So he, I think, lived a good life with an enormous amount of quiet dignity. But he has, for me, a certain heroism in doing what scientists have an obligation to do, which is call the cards as they see them and not to worry so much about what you think the implications are. That's a good lesson today as it was then. So why don't we know more about Fuller? Well, I mean, certainly racism has something to do with it. I just talked about some of the limits to his institutional advancement and absolutely that's true. But it's also true that we completely forgot about the early work in dementia, and specifically psychiatry for a long period of decades shunned anything that looked like autopsies. Even people who had done that work started to make fun of it, saying, you know, why all these visits to the charnel house? That's not where the interest lies. So all of the kind of work that Fuller did, this meticulous analysis of neuropathology, didn't seem important for another number of decades. But when people began to take a renewed interest in dementia, at the end of the 60s maybe, but more in the 70s and beyond, he had already said, I don't think it's just the plaques. It was very inconvenient because the early advocates of the resurgence were very caught up in plaque equating with symptoms, and they wanted it even to be dose dependent, not a lot of flexibility. So I think that was part of why he did not get sort of re-celebrated when we turned back to thinking about neuropathology. And for me, that's a real lost opportunity. So then things go along. We don't have the time, and you wouldn't want me to talk all about dementia research. I don't really even, I'm not an historian. I'm going to summarize it in a minute. The amyloid hypothesis. Okay, it's been really important. It's generated a lot of good information, and it is succinctly stated without many of its nuances that amyloid plaque is really a problem. It causes everything bad that happens, a cascade of damage, the tau tangles follow from that, and ultimately neuron death. And there you go, that's Alzheimer's disease. And there was striking and important data to support that. We know that people with Down syndrome who have trisomy 21 have too much amyloid because on that 21st chromosome is the gene that sort of is the precursor for making amyloids. People with Down syndrome, tons of amyloid, early onset, very high rate of getting a syndrome that looks like dementia. Excuse me. So there's also strong evidence from some of the relatively rare genetic variants around early onset Alzheimer's disease. Some of those people also have through the roof levels of amyloid, and that seems to be part of the trajectory. But it isn't so clear for the rest of us, for the far more common 95% of people who have late onset Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't necessarily look like there's such a clear connection between the amount of amyloid plaque and tau. We're learning so much more about this every day, and I'm not going to cover that whole story, but I will say we've tripped in some way. We were caught up so much in proving that it was amyloid that we missed some other opportunities, I argue. I know that can be controversial. But what happened? Multiple trials, and again, you all know all of this. Each trial, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of patients, over and over again. It's been 18 years since we had a new drug to treat dementia, and those are only palliative drugs. Now, I'm saying dementia because I'm not sure. I think part of the problem is that everybody that we think has Alzheimer's disease doesn't. Indeed, in some of these big studies, before we could routinely do PET scans on everybody who was enrolled, it turned out that 25 to 30% of the people referred by experts and enrolled in Alzheimer's disease studies didn't have an excess of amyloid. Well, maybe that's why the drugs didn't work with them. Or maybe we've mischaracterized what Alzheimer's disease really is. What is this syndrome? What is the thing we capture clinically that doesn't seem to match up, doesn't align all that well with an excess of amyloid? In any case, man, we're in trouble, even now. Aducanumab. Aducanumab was, and I'm not sure exactly how one pronounces that, is Biogen's drug. That is the most recent drug that has been very controversial. It was submitted to the FDA, and in December, I believe, the FDA's panels resoundingly said, we don't think so. We don't think there's sufficient data to show that aducanumab works to approve it for dementia. Something funny is happening though. Ordinarily, FDA acts fairly promptly to say, okay, the report's in from our distinguished panels, and it's either thumbs up or thumbs down based on what they said. This time, the FDA is going to wait till June to pronounce. So all of the, which has started kind of a shark feeding syndrome over in the markets, where people think that means that maybe we'll do aducanumab, not so much on what the basis of experts think. So listen, the verdict is still pending. I am not an expert who could look at that data and determine whether or not the drug meets criteria. I am, however, an observer of science. I think we need to stay with the data here. If you had the right experts in the room and they carefully looked at the data and they said, I don't feel it, I personally hope FDA stays with those recommendations. I believe in science and believe in staying with what the data tell us as best we can. Our data are imperfect because they're created by people and we're imperfect. But I think there's enormous pressure to approve a drug, but we don't need a drug that's not a good drug. So I hope we wait until we get the drug that we're looking for. That's not exactly it's not an approved drug, so I don't think I'd get in trouble for not recommending it. So we don't have a cure, but that doesn't mean there's no hope. And I say that because there's so many really dark and gloomy narratives about dementia. I got interested in this because both my mother and her mother had dementia. And this is a picture of my mother when she's quite young. I originally thought that was maybe a picture of her at her wedding, but indeed it is not, because I figured out she's only 13 there. So that's not how it works. So here she is in happier times. And actually, I think my mother had a decently happy life with dementia. And I don't think everybody does. And I think that's not, even absent the cure that we would all love to have, we could do a lot better in terms of care. So let me think with you about what that means. So there was a wonderful National Institutes of Aging Summit that just finished up, all virtually now because of the infamous COVID, but they really brought together fabulous people from across the country to think about what better can we do about dementia care services and supports? And they came up with a fabulous group of recommendations for what we need to look at. We need to better define why dementia is hard for both the people who have it and their caregivers. We need to learn more about the heterogeneity. We've done a pretty crummy job at looking at how Alzheimer's disease and related dementias vary from different geographic, ethnic, racial groups, and they do vary, and we haven't documented that adequately. We also need to think about bias. There are a lot of things that are not available to people with dementia, and it's not clear that that's right and proper. We also need to think about, what about the social determinants of health? What kind of role and how large is it in determining when people get dementia and what their dementia looks like and what options are available to them? And how can we promote well-being? This has been a huge issue in cancer. Even as we've worked on cure in cancer, we've also focused a lot more on, man, being treated for cancer. That's rough. Having cancer is rough. Let us help you while you're hoping to get better. Let's help you build hope today. Let's make today better, even while you're getting treatment. And thinking about financial outcomes and thinking about the workforce for dementia, which is in a bit of a mess. I am lucky enough, as our colleague mentioned on the way in, to chair a current existing committee at the National Academy of Medicine, which is what they call a Decadal Survey, which means go out and figure out what would be a roadmap for the next 10 years of research in the social and behavioral sciences. So it's not that we don't want pharma research, but this isn't the portfolio for this particular committee. We're supposed to look for social and behavioral science research, not devices or pharm that affects social and behavioral symptoms, but thinking about what do we have from all social science, and bring in also what we've chosen to do, which is, I'm sorry to say, relatively unfortunate, relatively rare at the National Academy of Medicine. We have adopted to include advisors who are people living with dementia and their caregivers to make sure we respond right to the actual needs of the people. And we're working away on that. And I can't share the recommendations with you because we haven't finished writing yet and because I'm not allowed to, but it's complete in June of 2021. So that's actually been really incredibly satisfying experience to work on. So I'm going to tell you some of what we found, which has been part of our public presentation. So no secret here. There is actually some good news. There is way better awareness today of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. There's actually, I was just earlier today interviewed by a reporter who's noted that there's a whole batch of new dementia movies. And she wanted to think about why that is. And this is why that is. Now people look about in their community and their family and they say, I know what that is. And maybe there's a story to tell there. I think that unless you're going to deal in negative stereotypes, I think it's a hugely positive advance that there are movies and television shows where people with dementia are part of the community, because that's true in real life. There's been a real uptick in the engagement of people with dementia and their caregivers in working with researchers, working with advocacy groups to figure out what is to be done here. How could we better support people? And there are some great interventions across the country. There is a recognition of the impact of social determinants of health. And as I said, these differences, as you would expect, because it's true in every single chronic disease we have, differences by ethnicity and race. And there's some interesting new approaches, including in technology and the arts. So there is definitely some good news. There's also some bad news. There are a lot of things we don't have together so well. And I'm going to walk through just a few examples to give you a sense of what's distressing. So taking them sort of from beginning to end, diagnosis is problematic for a lot of people with dementia. We don't do adequate support for the person with dementia, the caregiver. We don't integrate well between social support and medical care. We need more than medical care. We need to think about housing and protecting your finances and lots of different things in order to help people live more fully while they have dementia. A lot of people want to stay home safely. It's easier said than done. And nursing homes. COVID has showed us, wow, they were vulnerable to begin with, but man, have we had a Klieg light placed on how difficult it is to keep people healthy and safe in nursing homes and end-of-life care. What could we do better there? I won't talk about all of those, but let me give you a few examples. So diagnosis, there are lots of barriers to diagnosis, and we don't do a good job of connecting lots of needs to the services. So let me tell you what I mean. Here's an example. This is not this person's real photograph. This is just, I stole it from the internet. I didn't steal it. It's a publicly available photo from the internet, I say as an ethicist. But the person actually is very real. This is someone I knew. He was a friend of my extended family. He was funny, very dry, wicked sense of humor, even into his older age. He'd been quite a brilliant man, very successful in his chosen field. But at this time, late in life, he developed some symptoms that were very disturbing to certainly his wife of many, many years. He started to get really agitated, became pretty paranoid. His wife was extremely diminutive, a diminutive older woman. He pushed her, he hit her. That had never been part of his personality. It was totally out of character. He was a gentle person. He also had incontinence. So what's going on with that? They were affluent people. And I didn't know anything about this because people are often ashamed of dementia. They didn't know me that well anyway. So they didn't think to come to me, but they got some help that I don't think was great help. He went to see a geriatric psychiatrist, but his memory was largely preserved. So the geriatric psychiatrist decided he didn't have dementia. And the wife's point of view, perhaps inaccurate, is that they just sat around and chatted pleasantly together. And when she said to him, to the psychiatrist, he's hitting me, he's pushing me, he never did that before. The psychiatrist told her, I haven't seen that behavior, so I can't comment on it. Zero help for this family in incredible distress. I'm so embarrassed by that. Can we not really do better than that? He was never given a diagnosis of dementia by that psychiatrist or indeed by any physician. Ultimately, however, he fell down after about 4 or 5 years of this. He hit his head. And so he had a subarachnoid hemorrhage and he was taken to see a neurologist. And after several visits to the neurologist said in passing, well, you know, people with dementia, they have that issue. She went, dementia? She had asked about it for years. And everybody said, no, people get, funny as they get older. She asked about it and the diagnosis was denied her. So I know there's some people, and this is an active discussion still among some psychiatrists. What's the benefit of telling anybody? I'll tell you, this family was really harmed by not getting the diagnosis. They wasted a lot of money. They made some expensive errors. Had they known that dementia was on the menu for them, they would have handled a number of things differently. And I think it increased their confusion, their grief, and it was rough on them all around. So that's what I'm talking about. We did a survey as part of the National Academy of Medicine committee, and we got some really moving reports back from caregivers and people with dementia. But I wanted to show you this quote from the survey. This was from a person who's a caregiver who said, my dad was fine, throughout his adult life. And then in his 80s, he was getting very paranoid. He threatened people. He was confined to a psych ward because he was having terrifying hallucinations. And they sat the family down and told them he has schizophrenia. And this layperson who knew nothing particular, smart person, but not educated in psychiatry, said, that sounds weird to me. Why would you get schizophrenia at 80? Why indeed? That's not what he had. So you know what? We've got trouble. And here's the last of these that I'll mention. This is Mrs. C. Again, that's not really what she looks like, but this is based on a real person. Had relatively young onset dementia and had a brother who was an academic physician. So this loving brother takes a sister to a major medical center and she gets the #1 workup, every test and blood test and genetic test and a CAT scan and the PET and everything. And they come out. And the brother and the patient were sat down and told, you definitely have dementia. Basically, full stop. They were then, in their experience, and I wasn't there to record it, had the experience of this was a bomb dropped on us. They were, in their view, then just escorted out of the office. There was no follow-up, no connection to social support, no, how can I help you? And the patient was crushed and left with a million questions and no idea who she could bring them to. Should she quit work? She was an independent professional. Should she do that now? Did she have to move? What about her money? All the things that she wanted to follow up, she had no one to talk to about it. Now, I don't think that's the job of the neurologist. it's not necessarily the neurologist's task, but it's the patient's problem. And we need to do a lot better to sort of connect what our patients need through this process and bring it to them, rather than having each family, as pretty much now occurs, having to reinvent the wheel and go out and find it for themselves. So dementia workforce, and I think I'm getting, I'm just checking on my time. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So we do a great job at making sure that we don't have a good dementia workforce at every level, from physician to primary attendant. We pay everybody as low as possible. And yet there's a growing need for people to work for, to help people with dementia, because the numbers are going up, but the workforce numbers are shrinking. And there've been a lot of people who are aware of this and have tried to, and we are not getting closer to fixing it. Thinking just about physicians, geriatricians, it is, as far as I know, the only fellowship that when you do that, it actually reduces your paycheck. Yay, that's a way to get more people into geriatrics. And it means that there are plenty of fellowship opportunities that are going empty because people can't pay off their med school debt. So what's up with that? We need to figure this out. And there are some programs, but it may be too little too late. And how about the direct care providers, the people who are doing hands-on work at the bedside? This is really a national scandal. These are largely Black and brown women. Many are recent immigrants. Many get no benefits. They're part-time workers. And in order to feed their family, they have to work at more than one facility each week. So sometimes they'll do a 4-hour shift here, go to the same place, a different place on the same day. That was a perfect storm for COVID. That is part of why the rates of COVID infection were so high. It's because of the way we have forced the workforce of people who take care of dementia patients to do that. So low pay, no full-time work, no career path, no benefits, no sick leave in many nursing homes, particularly the nonprofit ones, but I would say just across the board, they had a tough time getting protective equipment, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, and testing was hard to come by. So that is really a shanda. And of course, you know that for people with dementia, COVID was devastating, absolutely devastating. But I'm going to remind you that even when we're not in a pandemic, death is one of the more common causes of discharge from a nursing home. You're there because, for the most part, you're older, and you're certainly there because you are frail and are unable to do things. Many people have multiple comorbidities. So what would good end-of-life care look like in a nursing home? Unclear. This is the only data slide I'll show you. This was particularly devastating to me. This is real-time data from Montefiore, large health system in the Bronx in New York. And we were among the hardest hit places in April in the country. So here's a grid. These are people, these are the youngest people, and this is the cumulative mortality by age if you're on a ventilator. We get up here to about 40% for our youngest group on this grid, which is 50. Up here, that's people who are older than 80. The mortality for those with COVID on a vent in April was more than 90%. I walk you through that horrible statistic to say, in this case, a ventilator was not a life-sustaining treatment for these older people, many of whom had come to us from nursing homes and had dementia. What would have saved their life is not getting COVID, and we didn't do that for them. So what does nursing home quality look like? I'll go through this relatively quickly. I mean, right now we're in a terrible spot where many nursing home patients basically feel like they are felons. They are treated, they're in lockdown, and it's very hard for them. There's a wonderful report that was put out by a group called Altarum from Washington, D.C. In 2020, interviewing nursing home residents. And this quote really summarizes their findings. If COVID doesn't kill me, loneliness will. So we got to figure out something better to keep people in the nursing home while the COVID pandemic lasts without killing them by loneliness. And we've kept them from getting COVID, but we haven't necessarily kept them from dying. So what could we do that would be better? Well, I hope something. That's the hard part. So in terms of the diagnostic process, I think the woman I showed you who got her diagnosis at a fancy academic medical center, that place met the standard of care. They did lots of tests. They told her, you meet criteria, bye, see ya. That qualifies as the standard of care. It's the wrong standard. there needs to be a handoff. You need to be able to receive that person and help them through what can be really tough for them. And some places are already doing that, but not every place. That's not the standard that everybody gets. And I wish it were. I wish we would build people a safety net instead of, as that family found, feeling like somebody had dropped a bomb on you. Beyond medical care, wow. There is a booming business in stealing money from people with minimal cognitive impairment and early stage dementia. And cruelly, financial capacity for many people is one of the first capacities that they lose. So you may be losing your ability to competently take care of your money before your family really notices any particular changes in your memory or your interaction with people. And we may not be that aware of it. Bad people are. And there's just a booming business in stealing money from people. And it's a lot of money because this is where everybody's retirement funds are. In terms of work, we could do better for people, and housing is really an issue. How can we do better to make sure that people who have dementia are not isolated, but are integrated, maybe within multi-generational settings, within communities and families? I'm losing my forward. There we go. Workforce improvements. If we only could fix this one thing, that would make an unbelievable difference. We need to find out how we're going to pay people better, even though we need more people. I think maybe tech could help us there. If you just have tech doing stuff that a person doesn't need to do, maybe you can afford to pay better the larger workforce that we're going to need. And we also need to include better dementia training among people who are not specialists in taking care of people with dementia. Primary care physicians, there have been multiple large surveys where 70, 80% of them are reporting, I don't have adequate training in either diagnosing dementia or figuring out how to help people when I do diagnosis. That's not okay. And there's no excuse for that. We have a lot of educational things that we could share with people. We don't effectively do it. And COVID-19, man, that has been an additional kick in the teeth for our country, for the world. The vaccine will help, but this is an issue with the workforce. Nursing home workforces, as I mentioned, are primarily made up of minority women, many of whom have a really, really high rate of vaccine hesitancy. This is a big issue. We have a total rupture of trust from many, many minority communities who no longer trust authorities, no longer trust the government necessarily, and no longer trust science, and are worried that if they get the vaccine, they will be victims because they know they have been before. It's not a case of paranoia. It's actually, to some degree, evidence-based decision-making. And yet, at the same time, tragically, this is the group that has been most decimated by COVID. We have to figure out what to do. So we need to plant a tree, and I'm a very avid, not skilled, but avid gardener. And there's a saying among gardeners, when is the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 20 years ago. Then you have to say, well, what is the second best time to plant a tree? And that answer is today. So that is what I hope you take away. Yes, it's a terrible time to improve dementia care, but it's also the best time that we can do it. And here's my rainbow for you in hope of better things to come. And here, because to some extent, I'm always flogging my book, there is a picture of it, and I'll take it away now, and we'll go to stop sharing. And I hope that we'll have a chance now to do some questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. And for audience members, please write into the chat any questions or comments that you would like to hear responses to, further elaboration on. I think I'm still smiling from this joke about planting a tree today. I can relate to that. Well, as people are getting set up with questions, I wonder, I mean, if you could talk a bit, a lot of times clinicians, Dr. Powell, may get cross-sectional observations, particularly in a hospital, particularly with trainees, observing severity, maybe without the longitudinal picture. How do you see maybe piecing that together with sort of episodes of acute care, trying to link that to piecing together dementia diagnosis, getting the major questions answered that family members or patients may have?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And I think, that is partly, we have such a fragmented healthcare system that if it was if we had what we imagined the good old days in healthcare to be, which is that you had a doctor who you knew, with whom you had a relationship, who saw you over years, we might be much more likely to expect that physician to say, this person is changing. I see that. I myself can get this sort of serial data. Most people now in the US do not have that, don't have a long-term ongoing relationship with a physician. So we've lost a major way to kind of observe cognitive change in real life as we go forward with people. There are a lot of tests that go forward. There are a lot of tests we can do that, but it is a problem. And we can, and that is a perfectly reasonable way to be part of our diagnostic system. But it's quite difficult. I mean, everybody listening to this talk is super educated. And actually the norms that apply sort of population-wide don't fit you that well. You have more years of education. I don't know why we did it, but we did it. We have more years of education than the vast majority of people. So it's not as easy to pick up necessarily subtle differences in our use of language, in our vocabulary, in our, maybe even in our personal reactions. Some people think that is why people with a lot of cognitive reserve, typically educated people, the lucky ones, once their diagnosis comes forward, there's an interesting phenomenon where they seem to have a very sharp decline. So there's some scholars that argue that that's because they're better at workarounds. They're smart. They know they're not going to remember anybody's name. And when they go around, they call everybody, hey, chief, hey, princess, how are you? I mean, it just, so we figure out, and everybody has an iPhone now. We're all constantly, writing things down that we don't want to forget. So it may be that our technology may make it harder, actually, to do a sort of subtle early diagnosis. Was shown to me the other day an interesting study that it's about to get started, a collaboration between Apple Watch, Google, and Biogen, where they're going to collect passive data through the Apple Watch and see if they can come up with a good way to clarify diagnosis of minimal cognitive impairment. I think that's really interesting because that could be data based on the individual person. So maybe maybe AI can help us here with big data. Maybe that would be a good use of that. I don't know, but I think there may be some ways to do better in terms of diagnosis and really sort of getting patient-specific information about cognitive deterioration in a more timely, sort of more specific fashion. Maybe we can do that going forward.
Thank you. Several questions. One, I think to start right off, is there a need for research in more of the psychosocial treatment, or do you feel that we just sort of need more money for existing clinical services?
That's a great question. I think we absolutely do. I think there's a really important example. So agitation, sort of behavioral acting out, it's a huge problem for people with dementia. That can be one of the signal symptoms that means you can no longer stay at home. That's when people are too much for their family to handle. If you're going to start slapping people, or you're paranoid and you're agitated and you're frightened and you're threatening people, your family's not going to be able to keep you at home. But even nursing homes don't want that person. That also gets people thrown out of the nursing home and then sent to a less desirable nursing home. We've tried to do it with pharmacology, and man, has that been a dismal failure. We've been snowing people with major tranquilizers, then they fall down and have broken hips, and that's the sort of, sort of spiral towards the grave. So we haven't done a great job with pharmacology, which kind of makes sense. These are fragile brains. They're older people. They're on 1 million medications. You're going to add another one in there, they're going to faint and fall over. I mean, so there have to be, and there are some interesting experiments with sort of non-pharm interventions that you might be able to train people up in. So there's some palliative care interventions for people with dementia that I think we could do much more with. I mean, some of them are like, tactile things, distraction, but what else could we do with that? What else could we do that would help people be brought away from that symptom that is causing them so much trouble? Could we do psychosocial interventions that would help there? That's why some people are using music. You know, I mean, with all the dementia studies, you see great stuff with people really responding to music. So there's been some good effect with that. I'd love to see us do more of that and figure out, you know, how to help. And it's not that I'm opposed to drugs. I'm just saying they have been our primary focus of research. I think we should continue doing that, but we need a much broader circle.
Two related questions. One is someone thought with how much money is being put into pharmacological research, wouldn't you expect something to come through soon, or do you think no?
So I'm kind of, you know, Debbie Downer, MD, on this topic. I think we have really, I'm not alone in this, but not everybody thinks this, so I'll say it's controversial. I think we got stuck on the amyloid hypothesis, and almost all of the drugs that we've tried to drag to market, including aducanumab, basically rely on the amyloid hypothesis. And there are more and more people who say, let's look for another hypothesis, or let's look for a more nuanced version. So many people have pointed out that tau actually is a much more sensitive indicator of when you're really going to get symptoms of dementia. Amyloid doesn't track that well with when you have symptoms. Tau tangles do. So maybe we need to have drugs that are looking at that. And people are starting to do that. So I personally do not think that there is going to be a winner on the ones that are trying to reduce amyloid. We can reduce amyloid. It just doesn't seem to have any impact on getting dementia, getting the symptoms of dementia. So a lot of our focus, we redefined a preclinical dementia, which just means you have amyloid. We don't even know if those people are going to go on to get symptoms ever. A lot of them don't. So I think that was a kind of a blind alley in research. So I think there are brilliant people who are working on this. I do think ultimately there'll be a breakthrough, but I think we stalled. I think we spent too much time with amyloid when it was not a rewarding venue. And I know that, I know from personal experience that some people get very angry when I say that, because they've been doing good work. We've learned a lot about how the brain works. We just haven't learned how to fix or prevent dementia. So yes, there will be a breakthrough. I'm in my 60s. I don't think it's coming from me. Whatever's happening in my brain that's going to take it to dementia or not to dementia, that ship has sailed, because the pathology starts probably 10, maybe 20, maybe more years before you actually get symptoms. So, and essentially no research that we're doing looks to undo that harm. It only looks to prevent the harm from happening. So for the baby boomer generation, and you thought the talk was depressing before, like basically, we should think a lot about good palliative care, because I don't think there's a fix that's coming for the baby boomer generation, I'm sorry to say. But maybe for kids.
Thank you. And a question from Dr. Carlson, a faculty geriatric psychiatrist. Along with palliative care for that group, what would a geriatric psychiatrist do today in a nursing home? What can be changed without a change in resources, without a change in funding? What would be an incremental step in the right direction?
Okay, I think that's such a great question. And I am not a geriatric psychiatrist, so I am drafting off the wisdom that other colleagues have shared with me. I think one of the most valuable things geriatricians do generally is deprescribing, is getting people off harmful drugs. You know, in some studies, the average number of medications for older people was more than a dozen. No one has ever studied what happens when you dump all of that into the same person and shake it up and see what happens. I mean, the interactive effects, yes. Side effects, yes. So helping it. So I think what a great geriatric psychiatrist can do today, and what some are doing when they're in the nursing home, is thinking about, let's not be using those medicines that are in the Beers criteria that say we shouldn't be using them in older people. So let's get rid of Ativan. Let's get rid of things that we know will get older people, or that are very likely to get older people into trouble. Let's see if we can use non-pharm interventions to help. I mean, I appreciate that it is very difficult if people get agitated and the staff or the person or the other patients are at risk. We need to figure out how to do that without the antipsychotics. And that, you know, that has been done, but we haven't done enough to find out, okay, what's instead of that? I think a lot of nursing homes are trying to deprescribe antipsychotics for people with dementia, but we don't have enough good in there. So I think that's already there.
And with 1 minute remaining, a very complicated question. So what about moving away from the medical model of dementia care? Considering maybe less of the value of diagnosis, more about focusing on functional or behavioral problems and addressing those. Yeah.
I think that's fine. I mean, I'm not sure that's moving away from a medical model in the sense that we're psychiatrists, you know? I mean, thinking about people's behavioral symptoms, how do you live the best life you can? I don't think that's not our model, but, or at least I refuse to concede that that's not our model. But I do think there's wonderful work to be done. And then that's really close to what I'm thinking about. I would love for there to be a cure, but meanwhile, we've been waiting a long time. And I would love to see us do more that really borrows from the palliative care model and says, for every day you have, let's see what we could do to make that better. What are your goals? How can we engage with people with dementia, just as we are learning to engage with lots of people with serious mental illness, and asking them, what are your goals? How can I help you get there? What would a good life look like for you? And let's figure out what steps. How can I support you in doing that? So think about how we balance housing that offers both safety and a degree of freedom. How can we do that? And I think we probably can. So I don't know what model that is, but I do think we could do so much more now to make lives better for people with dementia by taking that approach.
It's a caring model.
Yeah.
Sounds like
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, great. Unfortunately, we need to end due to being at 1 o'clock. But Dr. Powell, thank you so much for presenting today at Grand Rounds, joining us, going through the history and future directions here. Thank you again.
I'm happy to do it. Thanks so much for joining. Bye, everybody.
Take care.